In the marble halls of Renaissance Italy, where daggers gleamed as readily as smiles and words carried the weight of empires, Niccolò Machiavelli observed a fundamental truth that echoes through the corridors of power to this very day: respect is not given, it is taken. More precisely, it is commanded through the deliberate destruction of one's own weaknesses before any enemy can exploit them. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Palazzo Vecchio as Lorenzo de' Medici received word of yet another attempt to undermine his authority. A merchant guild had openly questioned his taxation policies in the public square, their spokesman's voice dripping with barely concealed contempt. Lesser men might have raged, plotted revenge, or worse, ignored the slight entirely. Lorenzo did none of these things. Instead, he smiled with the quiet confidence of a man who understood a secret that had taken him years to master: the weak self must die so that the powerful self may live eternally. This principle extends far beyond the marble floors of Italian palaces. In boardrooms where billion-dollar deals are forged, in political arenas where nations' fates hang in the balance, in the countless daily interactions where respect is either commanded or surrendered, the same immutable law applies. The man who permits disrespect to take root has already surrendered his most valuable asset, the perception of his own invincibility. Consider the anatomy of disrespect itself. It begins not with the disrespectful act, but with the observer's assessment of whether such an act will be tolerated. Every slight, every challenge to authority, every attempt to diminish a man's standing begins with a calculation: can I get away with this? The powerful man ensures that this calculation always yields the same answer: a resounding no. But how does one achieve such certainty? The answer lies not in external displays of force, though these have their place, but in the internal transformation that makes external challenges irrelevant. The weak self, that collection of insecurities, emotional reactions, need for approval, and fear of judgment, must be systematically identified and eliminated. Only when this internal enemy is vanquished can a man stand truly invulnerable to the attacks of others. The process begins with brutal self-examination. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world sleeps and pretenses fall away, the aspiring powerful man must confront his reflection not with kindness, but with the merciless clarity of an enemy seeking weaknesses to exploit. What makes him angry? What makes him defensive? What comments sting because they contain fragments of truth he refuses to acknowledge? These are the chinks in his armor, the vulnerabilities that invite disrespect like blood in the water invites sharks. Take the example of Marcus, a modern executive whose rise through the corporate hierarchy had been meteoric until he encountered his first real challenge to authority. During a board meeting, a junior colleague openly questioned his strategy, suggesting that Marcus was out of touch with market realities. The room fell silent, waiting to see how Marcus would respond. His first instinct was to defend himself, to explain why his strategy was sound, to prove his competence to the room. This instinct was his weak self speaking, the part of him that needed validation, that feared being seen as inadequate. Instead, Marcus paused. In that pregnant silence, he recalled the words of his mentor, a man who had built empires by never allowing his emotions to compromise his power. The weak self seeks to be understood, his mentor had said. The powerful self seeks only to be obeyed. Marcus looked directly at his challenger, his expression neutral, his voice calm. Your concern is noted and will be addressed in private. We'll continue with the agenda. The meeting proceeded without further interruption, and the junior colleague never again questioned Marcus publicly. More importantly, the rest of the board learned that challenging Marcus directly was futile. This response illustrates the first principle of shutting down disrespect on contact: emotional detachment. The weak self reacts emotionally to challenges, seeing them as personal attacks that require immediate defense or retaliation. The powerful self recognizes challenges as tests of strength that must be passed through demonstration, not explanation. But emotional detachment alone is insufficient. It must be coupled with what Machiavelli termed virtù, not virtue in the moral sense, but the combination of strength, skill, and adaptability that allows a leader to overcome any obstacle. This virtue manifests in the precise calibration of response to challenge. Too little response and disrespect spreads like a plague. Too much and one appears insecure, overreacting to minor threats. The powerful man's response is always exactly proportional to what is required to eliminate the challenge while preserving his energy for more important battles. The destruction of the weak self is not a one-time event but an ongoing process of refinement. Like a sculptor chipping away everything that is not the statue, the powerful man continuously identifies and eliminates aspects of his personality that make him vulnerable to manipulation or disrespect. This includes the need to be liked, which makes one vulnerable to those who would withdraw their approval as a form of control. It includes the need to be right, which makes one vulnerable to those who would challenge one's ideas not for the sake of truth but for the sake of dominance. Most dangerously, it includes the need to be seen as good, which makes one vulnerable to moral manipulation by those who would use ethics as a weapon. The Italian condottieri understood this principle instinctively. These mercenary leaders survived in a world where weakness meant death not through overwhelming force, but through the projection of invincibility. They cultivated reputations so fearsome that enemies would surrender before battles began, so precise in their responses to challenges that disrespect became unthinkable. They achieved this not by being the strongest or the most brutal, but by being the most controlled, masters of themselves first, and, through that mastery, masters of others. In the modern world, this principle adapts but never changes. The CEO who allows a subordinate to interrupt him in meetings will soon find every decision questioned. The politician who permits personal attacks to go unanswered will discover that attacks become the norm rather than the exception. The man who accepts disrespect in small matters will inevitably face it in large ones, as others learn that he can be pushed without consequence. The transformation from weak self to powerful self requires what psychologists call systematic desensitization, the gradual exposure to increasingly challenging situations until they no longer provoke emotional responses. The man seeking power must deliberately place himself in situations where his authority will be tested, using each test as an opportunity to strengthen his ability to respond from strength rather than weakness. Consider the case of David, a young lawyer who found himself constantly undermined by more senior colleagues who would interrupt him in meetings, dismiss his contributions, and generally treat him as inconsequential. His initial response was frustration and anger, emotions that only served to confirm his subordinate status. Following Machiavellian principles, David began a systematic campaign to remake himself. He studied the behavior patterns of the most respected partners, noting how they handled challenges. He practiced responses to various forms of disrespect until they became automatic. Most importantly, he identified and eliminated his need for their approval. The transformation became evident during a particularly contentious partner meeting where a senior colleague attempted to publicly humiliate David by questioning his competence on a case. Rather than defending himself or showing any emotional response, David simply said, "If you have specific concerns about my work, I'm available after the meeting to discuss them privately. Otherwise, I'll continue with my report." The tone was neither aggressive nor defensive, simply matter of fact. The challenger, deprived of the emotional reaction he sought, backed down. From that day forward, David's contributions were heard without interruption. This example illustrates another crucial aspect of destroying the weak self, the elimination of the need to prove oneself. The weak self constantly seeks validation and responds to challenges as opportunities to demonstrate worth. The powerful self recognizes that engaging in such demonstrations actually diminishes power by suggesting that one's authority is open to question. True power needs no proof, it simply is. The psychological mechanisms underlying this transformation are rooted in what neuroscientists call cognitive reappraisal, the ability to change one's emotional response to a situation by changing how one interprets it. When faced with disrespect, the weak self interprets it as a threat to self-worth that must be countered. The powerful self interprets it as irrelevant noise that requires only minimal attention to manage. This reappraisal process begins with understanding the motivations behind disrespectful behavior. In most cases, such behavior stems from the challenger's own insecurities and desire to elevate their status by diminishing others. Understanding this removes the personal sting from the attack while providing valuable information about how to respond most effectively. The man who challenges authority often does so because he feels powerless in other areas of his life. Recognizing this allows the powerful man to respond with the calculated precision of a surgeon rather than the wild swings of an amateur boxer. The elimination of the weak self also requires the cultivation of what Stoic philosophers called preferred indifference, outcomes that one might prefer but does not need for happiness or self-worth. The man who needs others' approval is vulnerable to having that approval withdrawn. The man who needs to be seen as competent is vulnerable to having his competence questioned. The man who needs to be liked is vulnerable to social rejection. By systematically reducing these needs to mere preferences, one becomes increasingly difficult to manipulate or disrespect effectively. This does not mean becoming emotionless or inhuman. Rather, it means developing the ability to choose one's emotional responses based on strategic considerations rather than automatic reactions. The powerful man feels emotions but is not controlled by them. He may prefer to be liked but does not need to be liked. He may enjoy approval but does not depend on it for his sense of self-worth. The practical implementation of these principles requires daily practice in small situations that gradually build tolerance for larger challenges. This might involve deliberately disagreeing with popular opinions in social settings to build comfort with disapproval. It might involve setting and maintaining boundaries with people who habitually disrespect them, regardless of the temporary discomfort this creates. It might involve practicing responses to common forms of disrespect until they become automatic. Most importantly, it requires the development of what military strategists call mission-type orders, clear principles that guide decision-making without requiring constant deliberation. For the powerful man, these principles might include: never explain what can be commanded, never justify what is unchallengeable, never react emotionally to tests of strength, and never permit small disrespects to go unaddressed. The man who successfully destroys his weak self discovers something remarkable: challenges to his authority become increasingly rare. This occurs not because he has become more intimidating, but because he has become more predictable. Others learn through experience that challenging him produces no emotional payoff and significant cost. Like water flowing around a stone, disrespect flows around the man who has made himself impervious to its effects. Part 2, The Art of Immediate Response. The second phase of mastering Machiavellian power lies in the precision of immediate response, the ability to shut down disrespect at the moment of contact with surgical accuracy. This skill separates the truly powerful from those who merely hold titles or positions. In the courts of Renaissance Italy, where Machiavelli observed the rise and fall of princes, the difference between a respected ruler and a deposed exile often came down to how quickly and effectively they responded to the first signs of challenge. Francesco Sforza, Duke of Milan, exemplified this principle during a pivotal moment in 1450 when a Venetian ambassador, emboldened by his city-state's recent military victories, publicly suggested that Milan's independence was a temporary inconvenience that would soon be corrected. The comment was delivered during a formal dinner attended by representatives from across northern Italy, making it both a diplomatic insult and a test of Sforza's resolve. Lesser rulers might have demanded an apology, threatened war, or worse, ignored the slight entirely while seething privately. Sforza did none of these. He simply stood, walked to the ambassador, and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Your concern for Milan's welfare is touching," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. "I'm sure Venice would appreciate the same level of attention you're showing us. Perhaps you should return to provide it." The ambassador found himself escorted to the door by Sforza's guards before he fully understood what had happened. Venice never again questioned Milan's independence so boldly, and other ambassadors learned that testing Sforza's patience was a luxury they could not afford. This response illustrates the fundamental principle of immediate action. Disrespect, like infection, spreads when left untreated. Every moment of hesitation, every pause for consideration, every attempt to rise above the slight sends a clear message to observers: this person can be challenged without immediate consequence. The powerful man understands that his response in the first 10 seconds after a disrespectful act will determine whether such acts become rare or routine. But immediate response does not mean impulsive reaction. The distinction is crucial and separates the genuinely powerful from the merely reactive. Impulsive reaction stems from the wounded ego, the weak self that feels compelled to strike back when hurt. Immediate response stems from strategic calculation so rapid it appears instinctive but is actually the product of extensive preparation and mental conditioning. Consider the modern parallel in the corporate world. James, the CEO of a major technology company, faced a moment that would define his leadership when a board member publicly questioned his strategic vision during an earnings call with analysts. Perhaps, the board member suggested, it's time for fresh thinking at the executive level. The comment hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet, with hundreds of analysts and journalists waiting to see how James would respond. His training in Machiavellian principles had prepared him for exactly this moment. Without pause, without visible emotion, James responded with deadly calm, "Thank you for that perspective. Since you've clearly given this significant thought, I'm sure you'll want to discuss your concerns properly. Let's schedule time immediately after this call." Then, he smoothly continued with the prepared presentation as if nothing had happened. The board member, suddenly, isolated and forced to wait for a private confrontation he was unprepared for, never again challenged James publicly. The analysts noted the CEO's unflappable composure under pressure, actually strengthening his position rather than weakening it. The key to such responses lies in what military strategists call prepositioned assets, responses prepared in advance for predictable scenarios. The powerful man knows that challenges to his authority will come, and he prepares his responses accordingly. This is not scripting, which would sound artificial and fail under pressure. Rather, it is the development of response frameworks that can be adapted to any specific situation while maintaining consistency of principle. These frameworks operate on 3 levels of escalation, each precisely calibrated to match the level of disrespect while maintaining the responder's dignity and authority. The first level involves subtle redirection, acknowledging the challenge while reframing it in terms that maintain the power dynamic. The second level involves clear boundary setting, making explicit that certain behaviors are unacceptable without becoming emotional or defensive. The third level involves decisive action, removing the challenger from the situation or imposing immediate consequences for their behavior. The art lies in selecting the correct level instantly, without hesitation or second guessing. This requires what psychologists call pattern recognition, the ability to categorize situations rapidly based on limited information. The powerful man has encountered enough challenges to recognize the underlying patterns instantly, the subordinate testing boundaries, the peer attempting to establish dominance, the superior asserting authority, the outsider probing for weakness. Each pattern requires a different response framework, but all responses share common characteristics: they are immediate, proportional, and final. Timing in response carries multiple layers of importance. The immediate response demonstrates control and preparedness. The person who must pause to consider how to handle disrespect appears unprepared and, therefore, weak. The person who delays response appears either unable to recognize the challenge or afraid to address it. Either perception invites further challenges. Conversely, the person who responds instantly appears to have anticipated the challenge, suggesting both awareness and preparation, qualities that discourage future challenges. But the response must also demonstrate restraint and precision. Overreacting to minor challenges appears insecure and wastes social capital that should be preserved for more serious threats. The powerful man's response is like a perfectly calibrated musical note. It resonates at exactly the right frequency to achieve the desired effect without creating unwanted harmonics that might complicate future interactions. This precision requires extensive study of human psychology and social dynamics. The man seeking power must understand how different types of people respond to different types of pressure. The insecure challenger often backs down when met with calm certainty. The aggressive challenger requires a demonstration of greater force. The calculating challenger needs to understand that challenging is not profitable. The ignorant challenger simply needs education about the proper hierarchy. Understanding these different challenger types allows for response customization that appears effortless but is actually highly sophisticated. Take the example of Robert, a department head who faced a new team member who consistently interrupted him during meetings. Analysis revealed that this person was not maliciously challenging authority but was simply accustomed to a more informal work environment. Robert's response was educational rather than confrontational. "I appreciate your enthusiasm. In our meetings, we'll finish complete thoughts before introducing new ones." The interruption stopped immediately because the challenger understood the framework rather than feeling attacked. Contrast this with Robert's response to a different team member who deliberately questioned his decisions in front of clients. This challenger was testing boundaries and required a different approach. That's an interesting perspective. Let's discuss it after we've completed this client presentation. The message was clear: challenges were acceptable, but the timing and forum were not. When similar behavior occurred again, Robert's response escalated. "John, I need to speak with you privately." The private conversation made clear that public challenges would result in public consequences, and the behavior ceased. The psychological effect of immediate, appropriate response extends far beyond the specific challenger. Observers learn crucial lessons about the power dynamic they are witnessing. They see that challenging this person's authority produces swift consequences, making them less likely to attempt similar challenges themselves. They also see that the person being challenged maintains complete composure and control, suggesting strength rather than vulnerability. Most importantly, they see that the challenger loses status through their attempt, making such attempts appear counterproductive rather than beneficial. This demonstration effect requires careful attention to audience and context. A response appropriate in a private setting might be counterproductive in a public one, and vice versa. The powerful man considers not only the immediate challenger but also the broader audience witnessing the interaction. Sometimes the real target of the response is not the challenger but the observers, who learn about power dynamics through watching how challenges are handled. The mechanics of immediate response also require physical and vocal control. The weak self betrays itself through body language, defensive postures, raised voice, fidgeting, or other signs of emotional arousal. The powerful self maintains complete physical composure regardless of internal emotional state. This requires training and practice, much like an actor learning to control their physical expression regardless of their personal feelings. Vocal tone carries particular importance because it conveys emotional state more directly than words. The voice that rises in pitch or volume suggests emotional arousal and, therefore, weakness. The voice that remains steady and controlled suggests confidence and preparation. The most powerful responses often involve lowering one's voice rather than raising it, forcing the challenger and observers to pay closer attention while demonstrating that one need not strain to be heard. Eye contact during response serves multiple functions. Direct eye contact with the challenger establishes dominance and prevents them from looking away or dismissing the interaction. However, extended eye contact can appear aggressive or confrontational in ways that might be counterproductive. The skilled practitioner uses eye contact like a precision instrument, intense enough to command attention but not so intense as to appear threatening or out of control. The timing of response also includes knowing when to end the interaction. The powerful response makes its point and moves on without belaboring it or allowing the challenger opportunities to extend the confrontation. Once boundaries have been established and consequences delivered, continuing to engage often serves the challenger's interests by providing additional opportunities to save face or redirect the conversation. This principle appears in the corporate world when executives handle public criticism during shareholder meetings. The effective response acknowledges the criticism, provides a brief factual correction if necessary, and then moves to the next agenda item without allowing the critic to expand their platform. Engaging in extended debate accomplishes nothing positive while giving critics additional airtime and suggesting that their challenges merit extensive discussion. The development of immediate response capability requires systematic practice in progressively challenging situations. This might begin with role-playing exercises where responses to various scenarios are rehearsed until they become automatic. It progresses to real-world practice in low-stakes situations where the consequences of imperfect responses are minimal. Finally, it culminates in the ability to handle high-stakes challenges with the same calm precision one might use to order coffee. The ultimate goal is response that appears effortless because it has become internalized at a deeper level than conscious thought. The powerful man does not need to decide how to respond to disrespect, his response emerges naturally from his transformed character. This automaticity prevents the hesitation and uncertainty that invite further challenges while ensuring that responses remain consistent with his overall strategic objectives. Part 3, The Invulnerable Self and Permanent Dominance. The third and final phase in achieving Machiavellian mastery involves the construction of what can only be described as the invulnerable self, a personality architecture so complete and self-contained that it becomes impossible for others to find purchase for their attacks. This represents the culmination of the process that began with destroying the weak self and continued with mastering immediate response. At this level, the practitioner transcends reactive power and achieves what Machiavelli termed the fortress of the mind, a state where external challenges become not just manageable but irrelevant. The historical archetype of this achievement emerges in the figure of Cesare Borgia, whose rise and temporary fall Machiavelli studied with fascination. Borgia's power rested not merely on his armies or political connections, though these were formidable, but on his psychological invulnerability. Enemies found that attacking him was like striking at mist. Their blows passed through without effect because there was nothing in Borgia that needed their approval, feared their judgment, or could be wounded by their hostility. Even when political circumstances temporarily stripped him of external power, his psychological dominance remained intact, commanding respect from allies and enemies alike. This invulnerability operates through multiple interconnected mechanisms that together create a psychological state that others recognize instinctively as unassailable. The first mechanism is complete outcome independence, the ability to remain equally composed whether external circumstances favor or oppose one's immediate desires. The man who needs specific outcomes is vulnerable to those who can control or threaten those outcomes. The man who maintains his strategic objectives while remaining flexible about specific results becomes nearly impossible to manipulate or intimidate. Consider the example of Maria, a senior executive who faced a coordinated campaign by several colleagues to undermine her authority and force her resignation. They scheduled meetings without including her, questioned her decisions in public forums, and spread rumors about her competence. A conventional response might have involved fighting each challenge directly, defending her record, or seeking allies to counter their influence. Instead, Maria demonstrated complete outcome independence. She continued executing her responsibilities with the same precision and professionalism she had always shown, neither defending herself against attacks nor appearing concerned about their potential success. The psychological effect on her attackers was devastating. They had expected anger, desperation, or at least visible concern, emotions they could exploit to justify their campaign and attract additional support. Instead, they found themselves attacking someone who appeared genuinely indifferent to their efforts. Without emotional payoff from their target, the campaign lost momentum. Some attackers began to question whether their efforts were worthwhile. Others started to worry that Maria's apparent confidence suggested resources or support they were unaware of. Within months, the campaign collapsed, and several of the original attackers found themselves seeking to repair relationships with someone they now recognized as more powerful than they had initially understood. This outcome illustrates the second mechanism of invulnerability, emotional invisibility. The truly powerful person becomes emotionally opaque to others, preventing them from reading emotional states that might indicate vulnerability or opportunity. This does not mean becoming emotionless, but rather developing the ability to choose which emotions to display and when to display them based on strategic considerations rather than automatic responses. The development of emotional invisibility requires mastering what intelligence professionals call operational security for emotions. Just as sensitive information must be protected from enemy intelligence services, emotional states must be protected from those who would use them for manipulation or attack. This means never revealing frustration, disappointment, fear, or anger unless doing so serves a specific strategic purpose. It also means never revealing excessive joy, excitement, or satisfaction that might be interpreted as weakness or provide information about what one values most highly. The third mechanism involves the cultivation of what philosophers call autarky, complete self-sufficiency in all matters essential to one's well-being and self-worth. The person who depends on others for validation, approval, entertainment, or emotional regulation remains vulnerable to having those dependencies exploited. The invulnerable self generates its own validation, provides its own emotional regulation, and maintains its own sense of purpose independent of external circumstances or other people's opinions. This self-sufficiency extends beyond emotional needs to encompass intellectual and spiritual independence. The man whose beliefs depend on social approval will find those beliefs challenged when approval is withdrawn. The man whose sense of purpose depends on external recognition will find that purpose undermined when recognition is denied. The truly invulnerable person develops belief systems and purpose structures that remain stable regardless of external validation or opposition. The practical development of autarky begins with systematic identification of all external dependencies that create vulnerability. This includes obvious dependencies like financial reliance on specific individuals or institutions, but also subtler dependencies like the need for social interaction, entertainment, or intellectual stimulation from others. Each dependency represents a potential attack vector that enemies might exploit, and each must be either eliminated or secured through multiple redundant sources. Consider the case of Thomas, a successful entrepreneur whose business empire began crumbling during an economic downturn. His competitors, sensing opportunity, launched a coordinated attack on his reputation and remaining assets, expecting to find him emotionally devastated and strategically confused. Instead, they discovered that Thomas had spent years developing intellectual and emotional autarky. He had studied philosophy extensively, developing a personal worldview that remained stable regardless of external circumstances. He had cultivated interests and skills that provided satisfaction independent of business success. Most importantly, he had developed a sense of identity that transcended his role as an entrepreneur. The result was that Thomas navigated the crisis with the same calm focus he had shown during periods of expansion. While competitors waited for signs of panic or desperation they could exploit, Thomas systematically rebuilt his empire using the same principles that had created it originally. His competitors, having revealed their willingness to attack during vulnerability, found themselves facing an opponent who was not only undamaged by their assault but now fully aware of their hostile intentions. Several who had participated in the attack later found their own businesses facing mysterious difficulties as Thomas applied lessons learned during his temporary setback. The fourth mechanism of invulnerability involves the development of what ancient strategists called strategic depth, multiple layers of resources, relationships, and capabilities that prevent any single attack from achieving decisive results. Just as military forces develop defense in depth to prevent breakthrough attacks, the powerful individual develops personal and professional resources in depth to prevent social or economic attacks from reaching critical vulnerabilities. Strategic depth operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Financial depth means having resources distributed across multiple vehicles and institutions so that no single economic attack can achieve decisive results. Social depth means maintaining relationships across multiple networks so that exclusion from any single group does not result in isolation. Professional depth means developing skills and reputation across multiple domains so that failure in any single area does not threaten overall capability. Intellectual depth means mastering multiple frameworks for understanding reality so that challenges to any single belief system do not threaten overall worldview stability. The development of strategic depth requires long-term thinking and systematic investment in areas that may not provide immediate returns but create future options and resilience. This might involve developing expertise in fields outside one's primary profession, cultivating relationships with people across different industries and social circles, or building financial reserves that provide freedom of action during crises. The key principle is redundancy, ensuring that no single point of failure can compromise overall capability or freedom of action. The psychological effect of strategic depth extends beyond its practical benefits to influence how others perceive and interact with the individual who possesses it. People instinctively recognize when someone has nothing to lose versus when someone has multiple options and fallback positions. The person with strategic depth projects an aura of confidence and capability that discourages attacks while attracting opportunities and alliances. The fifth mechanism involves the mastery of what Machiavelli called sprezzatura, the appearance of effortless superiority that makes one's power seem natural rather than achieved. This subtle but crucial element prevents others from believing they can replicate one's success through study or effort, maintaining the mystique that keeps challenges minimal and respect high. Sprezzatura operates by making one's capabilities appear innate rather than developed, discouraging others from attempting to compete directly while establishing a psychological hierarchy that others accept as natural. The development of sprezzatura requires careful attention to how one's capabilities are displayed and discussed. Actions must appear effortless even when they require significant preparation or skill. Knowledge must be shared in ways that highlight its depth while making its acquisition seem natural rather than laborious. Success must be acknowledged in ways that suggest competence rather than luck while avoiding displays of pride or effort that might invite challenges. Consider the example of Alexander, a young attorney who rapidly advanced through one of the country's most prestigious law firms despite facing initial skepticism from senior partners. Rather than demonstrating his capabilities through obvious effort or aggressive self-promotion, Alexander developed a reputation for solving complex legal problems with an ease that made other attorneys question their own approaches. When asked about his methods, he would provide helpful guidance while making his insights appear to emerge from natural intuition rather than systematic analysis. The psychological effect was that colleagues began to see Alexander as possessing natural legal instincts rather than superior work ethic or training. This perception made competing with him seem futile rather than challenging, leading to acceptance of his rapid advancement rather than resentment. Senior partners began seeking his input on difficult cases, viewing his contributions as valuable resources rather than threats to their own status. Within 5 years, Alexander had achieved partnership not through political maneuvering but through the establishment of a reputation for effortless superiority that made his advancement appear inevitable rather than ambitious. The culmination of these 5 mechanisms creates what can only be described as a field effect, a psychological presence that influences others before any specific interaction begins. People approaching the truly invulnerable person find themselves already adjusting their behavior, moderating their challenges, and accepting hierarchical positions before conscious thought occurs. This field effect operates through subtle cues that communicate strength, preparation, and independence so clearly that others respond instinctively rather than deliberately. The field effect manifests in countless small ways: the quality of attention others pay when the person speaks, the deference shown in seating arrangements and meeting protocols, the careful consideration given to requests or suggestions, and the reluctance to offer unwelcome advice or criticism. These responses occur automatically as others recognize, consciously or unconsciously, that they are dealing with someone who cannot be easily moved, influenced, or intimidated. The maintenance of this invulnerable state requires constant vigilance against the gradual erosion that occurs when one becomes comfortable or complacent. The weak self is never truly destroyed but rather held in permanent suppression through disciplined practice and conscious choice. Relaxing this discipline allows old patterns of dependency, emotional reactivity, and strategic vulnerability to reassert themselves, gradually undermining the psychological architecture that creates invulnerability. This maintenance operates through daily practices that reinforce the core principles while adapting to changing circumstances. These might include regular self-examination to identify emerging dependencies or vulnerabilities, systematic relationship audits to ensure strategic depth is maintained, and deliberate exposure to challenging situations to prevent the atrophy of response capabilities. The goal is not perfection but rather the maintenance of a standard sufficiently high that others recognize the futility of challenge while remaining confident in the certainty of consequences for disrespect. The ultimate achievement of this process is the transformation of power from something one exercises to something one embodies. The truly invulnerable person does not need to demonstrate power because others recognize it instinctively. They do not need to threaten consequences because others understand them intuitively. They do not need to demand respect because others offer it automatically. This represents the completion of Machiavelli's vision: power so complete and self-contained that it operates through presence rather than action, through being rather than doing. The man who achieves this state discovers a paradox that Machiavelli observed but never fully explained: the more invulnerable one becomes to others' attacks, the less necessary it becomes to use this invulnerability defensively. When no one challenges, there is no need to respond to challenges. When respect is given automatically, there is no need to command it. When one's position is accepted as natural, there is no need to defend it. The ultimate expression of power is the absence of any need to exercise it, achieved through the complete destruction of the weak self that once invited attack and the construction of an invulnerable self that makes attack appear futile. This transformation represents more than personal development, it constitutes a fundamental shift in one's relationship with reality itself. The weak self lives in constant negotiation with external circumstances, seeking favorable outcomes while fearing unfavorable ones. The invulnerable self transcends this negotiation entirely, maintaining equanimity and strategic focus regardless of external conditions. This shift creates freedom of action impossible for those still bound by emotional dependency, social approval, or outcome attachment. The legacy of this achievement extends beyond immediate personal benefit to influence all future interactions and relationships. Others learn through experience that this person operates by different rules, commanding respect not through force but through the obvious futility of disrespect. This creates a compound effect where reputation reinforces reality, making each subsequent interaction easier to manage while reducing the frequency of challenges that require management. In the end, Machiavelli's vision proves both prophetic and practical. The man who destroys his weak self becomes truly indestructible by others, not because he cannot be harmed but because he cannot be moved. He achieves the rarest form of power, dominance so complete it appears effortless, respect so automatic it seems natural, and strength so evident that it discourages all challenges before they begin. This is the ultimate expression of political virtue in both Renaissance Italy and the modern world, power perfected through the systematic elimination of everything that makes power necessary.